I think we can probably just start. Zelda.
Great, thank you everybody. Welcome to everybody who has joined, especially on what is probably a day when you're wilting and melting. So thanks for the commitment. Might be the hottest day on record here in England, which is quite a sad self-inflicted milestone. So we're all the ones here quite committed to learning the latest evidence and thinking on delaying adolescent childbearing, especially which structural interventions address those broader drivers of early fertility, those quite large and intractable issues that really need attention, and more deeply, what's that mid-range theory or the mechanism that has the most promise of working across diverse contexts and populations. And those were the goals of Helen Burchett and the team behind the research that will be presented today. Helen's an associate professor here at London School, where she bridges her past worlds of NHS public health promotion and her rigorous research syntheses at the Institute of Education, now to focus very much on uncovering how and why interventions work, so that we can replicate and apply the most promising ones in different contexts. We have two fantastic experts very well placed to respond to Helen's study, having led work in adolescent sexual reproductive health themselves for many decades. So I'll introduce Karen Austrian and Chandra Mooley after Helen's presentation. Helen will present for about 25 minutes, and the panelists will then respond for about 15 minutes before we can all enjoy a panel discussion with opportunities for questions and answers in the Q&A box before we then close at 1:15. Okay, so I'll start by inviting Helen, thanking Helen for sharing the review and the findings, with thanks to the Sport of Sedil, which is funded through UK Aid with money from the British people, and I think non-British people paying taxes here too, so that all of us contributed. Thank you. Thanks so much, Helen, and welcome.
Hi, thanks everybody. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my slides? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes, we can. Yeah,
sure.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Yes. Okay, fantastic. Let me try and minimize all this so that I'm not confused by all. No, I can't. Okay, fabulous. So thank you all for coming. I hope you're all staying cool. As mentioned, our project was looking at structural interventions aiming to enable adolescent use of contraception in low and middle income countries. Although actually, as Chandra had pointed out to me previously, these actually also have relevance to high income countries, but as this is funded by UK Aid, the remit was low and middle income countries. Sorry, there we go. So when we talk about structural interventions, we're talking about interventions that address upstream factors. So rather than focusing on interventions that provide information or alter health services or try and change and address knowledge, attitudes and behaviors, we're looking at things that address the factors that might influence those things. So things like poverty, we might look at interventions that increase girls' economic status, or education, increasing participation in schooling, for example. We might look at interventions that try to address girls' low status or lack of power by trying to use various activities to empower girls, to increase their agency. Or we might try to address social norms, so changing gender or fertility norms, particularly norms around adolescent fertility and sexuality. So what did we do? Well, firstly, we updated a search conducted by 3IE in 2016. They did an evidence gap map looking at sexual and reproductive health intervention evaluations. We focused on the contraceptive part of that, but because that was conducted in 16, we also updated it. We then used qualitative comparative analysis, which is a case-based method that aims to look at which combinations of characteristics might explain a set of studies. And then we looked at intervention component analysis is another method we used, which is another case-based approach where you look at kind of all of the information that can be provided from a paper. So not just what the intervention was and what the findings were, but also what insights can be gleaned from the introduction section or in the discussion. Maybe the authors have some insights as to why they think the intervention had the effect it did, or some insights into the implementation or how the intervention was experienced and received by participants, as well as obviously looking at all other aspects of the intervention, the findings and so on as well. So what types of interventions have been evaluated? Well, we screened nearly 7,000 references and included 40 intervention evaluations that were reported in 63 papers. Excuse me if you can hear banging. My son is off school playing football in the other room because of the heat. I'm going to try and ignore it. So what I should say as well is that of these 40 intervention evaluations, almost half were not published in academic journals or academic databases. So it was really, really helpful that we did lots of hand searching of organizations' websites, rather than just focusing on what traditional systematic reviews would do, focusing on academic databases. That would have missed quite a lot of the intervention evaluations if we'd done that. In terms of the structural activities that were included in the interventions, most included economic empowerment type activities, things like cash transfers or livelihoods training, or opening savings accounts for girls, or financial literacy training. 17 were around encouraging school participation, either addressing school fees, reducing or paying for school fees, or paying for school supplies like school uniforms, or changing legislation to increase the number of years of primary schooling, or working with families and communities to increase participation in school. And 13 aimed at changing community social norms. And by this, we don't mean things like mass media. We required them to have active engagement with the community, because social norms we know are really, really hard to change. And we're not convinced that more passive methods like mass media can actually go that step of actually changing norms. And as you can see, these add up to more than 40, because most had more than one structural activity. Half of the studies were randomized controlled trials, 14 were non-randomized, and there were 8 natural experiments where they used survey data to try and assess the impact of national policies or legislative changes, such as increasing the length of primary school, or cash transfer scheme, such as Oportunidades in Mexico. In terms of outcomes, pregnancy and birth outcomes were most common, but there were a range of different outcomes, such as have the participants or the respondents ever been pregnant? Are they currently pregnant? Or were they ever pregnant before the age of 20? Half of the study had contraceptive use outcomes. And again, these varied from whether they're currently using contraception, whether they had ever used contraception, whether they used it at first sex or last sex, or whether they usually or always used it, or only sometimes or never used contraception. And then there were also 9 other outcomes related to this, such as ideal age at first birth and ideal number of children that they wanted to have in total. So we took these results to our advisory group, and I'm very grateful for Karen and Chandra for being on that advisory group. And we discussed what we should focus on at the in-depth review. And it was agreed that we'd focus on the set of studies that reported contraceptive outcomes, because this is what our review was supposed to focus on. And obviously pregnancy and birth outcomes could be influenced by factors other than contraceptive use, like age at first sex, the frequency of sex, or marriage, and so on. 10 of the studies that we included in the in-depth review were conducted in Africa, 4 in Asia, and 3 in South America. And so these 17 studies had 29 structural intervention arms that we included. So we conducted a meta-analysis to try and have a look at these, and we ordered them according to their odds ratio, using, where possible, current contraceptive use at 12 months. But as I mentioned previously, there was a lot of variation in the outcome measures used. So some were not at 12 months follow-up, some included condoms whilst others excluded them, and some didn't report current contraceptive use they used and ever used, or some other measure. So we tried to categorize these according to whether they were likely effective, possibly ineffective, or likely ineffective or harmful. And there's one study missing here that we couldn't include in the meta-analysis. This was the Disher study, but we categorized it as likely effective. Having said that, at this point, we had planned to do a risk of bias assessment, quality appraisal, but we recognized that actually there was a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the methodological issues in the studies. And whilst these weren't necessarily coming out in the risk of bias assessments, they weren't necessarily markers of poor quality. It did mean that it undermined our confidence in our categorization here. So, for example, there were different types of control arm activities, and there was different study designs, different outcome measures used, as I've mentioned, and different samples as well. So some sampled all participants, whether or not they had ever had sex, others only focused on married, adolescent, or only those that had ever had sex. And there was a lot of variation that basically meant that we lacked confidence in this. So we conducted a qualitative comparative analysis looking at the methodological issues that we had raised to see if they were more prevalent in either the likely effective or the likely ineffective and harmful sets. And what we found was these issues did run across all study times. They were present in all the studies in both sets. So although we couldn't therefore say that they explained why one set of studies were likely ineffective or harmful or likely effective, it did just mean that we didn't have confidence in this rating. So instead, what we decided to do was, rather than then move on and just look at the likely effective and likely ineffective to look at the differences that we'd hoped to, we decided to look at all of the study arms using intervention component analysis instead. And for this, we used ICRW's conceptual framework for adolescent family planning. So they specified that there were 5 objectives, as well as an enabling environment that, if met, leads to the goal of sustained effective use of family planning. Now, looking at this, we felt that some of the objectives were more suited to non-structural interventions. They were less influenced by upstream factors. So that would be objective 2, desire to use family planning, and also the 2 supply side factors, access to family planning services and provision of quality youth-friendly services. They might be better addressed by providing information about family planning and the risks and myths or risks of side effects, and also by supply side factors, trying to improve quality or accessibility of services. So we felt that structural interventions could really have their most impact on objective 1, desire to limit, avoid, space or delay childbearing, objective 3, which is agency to use family planning, and also the enabling environment, which kind of touches on all of them. So with this, we felt there were 3 steps to take for designing effective interventions. So the first step is tailoring interventions to the adolescent's life stage. As some of the studies did mention, adolescence is a period of often rapid transition through different life stages, and you get, rather than assuming adolescents are all the same, there's a real heterogeneity there in terms of whether they're married or not, whether they have children already or not, they may be in school or out of school. And although this seems really critically important, only 5 studies took account of the different life stages and targeted interventions, either focused on one specific life stage, for example, married adolescents, or they targeted and tailored the intervention so that different activities were run for different adolescents at different life stages. The second step is to assess the baseline situation for each of the 5 objectives and the enabling environment. So although some studies did conduct formative research to try and understand the situation in their context in order to inform the design of their intervention, there wasn't really use of this framework in order to understand the baseline situation for each objective, to then understand where are the gaps, which objectives might already being met, and where should the interventions best target their efforts. So it's really to do with understanding your baseline context. And then the third step is selecting appropriate intervention activities to match the objectives that you've identified that need to be met. So here I just report these agency concepts, so would fit with objective 3. However, I haven't spoken specifically about objective 1, increasing the desire to delay, reduce, space or limit childbearing. And firstly, that's for the reason because the activities that you might do for that overlap with the activities here, but also there's there's a kind of ethical issue there of just not making that assumption that all adolescents should be wanting to use family planning, if you like. They should be wanting to delay, space, limit, or avoid childbearing, which is an ethical issue that's way beyond the remit of this project. But in terms of objective 3, increasing agency to use contraception, we used Van Erdrich and colleagues' 2017 conceptual framework, where they conceptualized agency as being multidimensional and involving choice, voice, and power. So we recognize that within choice, we think there are space for increasing opportunities and aspirations for adolescent girls. So this could be, for example, through experience of livelihoods education, or through support for schooling, or through employment opportunities. Choice could also be increased by recognizing and demonstrating girls' value beyond motherhood. So this could be, again, through vocational support or income generating support. And I'll talk a bit more about this value beyond motherhood in a moment. In terms of voice, most of the studies that looked at increasing adolescent girls' voice focused on training, so communication and negotiation training, or relationship training, or gender rights training. But one study actually incorporated a kind of civic engagement or community development program, where the girls got involved with community projects and were able to increase their voice in the community. But that was quite rare. It was much more of the studies focused on communication, negotiating training, and training to kind of encourage them to enable them to use their voice, if you like. Then the third agency element is power. Again, is split into 3 elements. So there's power to make decisions. And again, there was often a focus on training girls around decision making, but there were also a few studies that encourage girls to give them the experience of decision making. And finally, there's economic empowerment, which, as you saw earlier, was quite a common structural intervention that was used, that we theorized could increase girls' power to make their own decisions. If they're earning their own income, for example, they might find that they have more status in the family, or they're more able on their own to make decisions for themselves. The second aspect of power is power within, which refers to esteem. And one example of that would be in safe space groups, where they built specifically aimed to build girls' confidence. We didn't actually conceptualize safe space groups as being structural per se, but quite a lot of the structural interventions that we included did incorporate that activity. And it seems that that's could be a really good way to hook in some structural activities. And then finally, it's the last aspect of power is power with. And that could be things like building social networks. So some studies really recognized that adolescents could be socially isolated, particularly newly married adolescents, especially if they have to move to a new area in their new marital home, and if they lacked the opportunity to socialize outside of the home, and also through mentors that were part of the safe space kind of model, where they'd have an older woman mentoring them who could offer that support. And finally, do you remember surrounding all of the objectives in the model is fostering an enabling environment. And we felt there were 2 main types of activities that could foster an enabling environment. And firstly, it's this active engagement with communities. So this could be through things like community conversations or active community dialogue. Some interventions incorporated setting up or using existing community groups and doing action planning with them, or they set up adult youth partnership programs where they listen to and talk to each other, and those sorts of interventions. And then the second thing, which I've touched on briefly previously, was demonstrating girls' value beyond motherhood. This could be to do with their future value, if you like. So looking at things like aspirations through livelihoods experience. One study gave a period of vocational experience to girls, and they expressly said that this was not so that they could then be trained up to go and get a job, but just so they'd have a flavor of the sorts of things that they could go on and do when they were older, just to kind of increase their aspirations and so on. But as well as future aspirations, which could also be potentially increased through increased schooling, if you're investing more in putting a girl through schooling, it suggests that you're valuing them beyond just becoming a mother, but potentially having other worlds as well, but also to do with their current value. So, for example, through income generating schemes, or there was a study in Ethiopia, Bahrain Huon, where they had groups for married adolescent girls where they taught them skills around gardening, so they could grow crops that their family could then eat, and any excess could be sold. They taught them how to build basic household furniture that then everyone in their household and potentially beyond could see that they were producing this, and other skills like showing them how to build more efficient cooking stoves. So these were then skills that the girl could then take away and demonstrate their value to other people, so they could see that they weren't just good for making babies, but they had other skills as well. Another project, for example, taught adolescent girls how to use mobile phones and devices, which at that time in that setting was quite unusual, and it gave them, the authors were very clear that this gave them an increased status, if you like. It showed that they had this new skill set of this new novel kind of digital technology that not everybody else had. So it raised their status in that respect. So that's both future and current value could be increased, and not just demonstrating it to the girls themselves so that it boosts their self-esteem, but demonstrating it to others in their family, their households, and the wider community. So I have quite a few recommendations I could go through, but firstly, there's one around outcomes and indicators. And I feel like if, as a field, we could come together and reach some consensus as to what outcomes to use, and particularly what indicators we could use around the objectives, so understanding the baseline levels, and then we could use those indicators again to assess impact later on. But particularly as well around agency, because there are lots of different indicators used, and it's hard to then firstly track across studies and compare across studies. But also a lot of these indicators around agency are not specific to contraception, and then you have that challenge of not knowing whether they would then track across to contraceptive agency, if you like. So for example, you could ask, some studies asked girls whether they were able to travel outside the village unaccompanied, but whether that means they would be able to travel outside the village to seek contraception, don't know if that's the case or not. Secondly, there's an issue around study design factors, and this is a recommendation not just to people that are conducting evaluations, but obviously those funding evaluations as well. Several of the study authors, for example, highlighted the limitation of having a short follow-up time. Some studies were not able to actually finish the implementation before the follow-up happened, which meant that you're not measuring the full impact of the intervention. Others, especially those targeting very young adolescents, but also older adolescents as well, found that if the intervention was delivered before the adolescent girls had ever had sex, you needed to wait a considerable period before enough of those girls had started having sex for you to then ask them about contraceptive outcomes. And often the funding is not just available for that. I could talk a lot longer about these methodological issues, but I'll move on. There's more interesting things to discuss at this point in time. Finally, I think it's really important to understand how these interventions work, not just which interventions work, but by understanding how, it really helps you understand what could work in another setting, but also potentially moving beyond contraceptive use, because obviously structural interventions can impact on a whole range of outcome. And as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, childbearing is not influenced by contraception alone, but actually a structural intervention, by understanding how it works, we could see how it might impact on contraceptive use, but also sex and marriage and all these other related factors. So some of the most useful information that we got from the study reports was where we got insights into how the intervention was implemented and how it was experienced, either by those people delivering the intervention or the participants or the wider community, to really try and unpick and understand how interventions work. So providing this sort of information and also incorporating qualitative or ethnographic components to intervention evaluations, I think is really important. And finally, I think it would be really great to test and refine this three-step approach that's kind of operationalizing the ICRW framework. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Helen. I didn't even get to give you your 2-minute warning because you were exactly 2 minutes before time. So thank you for that, concise and very clear. You also have very nice visuals, so thank you for that. We now have a chance to hear from our discussants. So first, I'm really happy to welcome Karen Upstream to the webinar. Thanks so much, Karen, for joining us today. Karen is director of the Girls Centre at Population Council, and that's a global hub to generate and apply evidence on adolescent health. Karen has led many studies to trial and evaluate strategies for girls' empowerment, and several of them do feature in the review that Helen has presented. So we'll hear a little bit more about them now. Thank you very much, Karen.
Hi, everyone. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, both to be a part of the advisory group for this, for Helen's project. It's been really an honor to be a part of this work, and for the opportunity to share a bit more today. I'll talk just briefly a little bit about framing, taking a multi-sectoral approach to framing, and then I'll go more into detail about the Adolescent Girls Initiative Kenya trial, which features in Helen's work. And I think actually maybe is a nice follow-on to that presentation to share a little bit about, or just, you know, show more in detail how one of these structural interventions works and the pathways and some of the processes that we went through as a team. So in thinking about this multi-sectoral approach, our work at the Girls Center really thinks about sort of the whole girl, or putting her at the center. And in order to do that, we see that all the critical issues of today, whether they be, you know, longstanding issues we've been researching and studying like education, child marriage, or newer ones like COVID-19, digital access, etc. These don't exist in silos in girls' lives. And I think as we think about both how to design interventions and then what are the outcomes that we're looking at for girls, we need to think about the ways in which not only do each of these areas intersect with girls' lives, but how do they intersect and relate with one another? So I think also another thing that's important to acknowledge is that adolescence is a period of very dynamic development, really happening in all facets of adolescents' lives, whether that's their cognitive development, their physical development, their social development. I mean, just take a second and think about what an 11-year-old girl looks like and what a 16-year-old girl looks like. And their brains, their bodies, and their social worlds are very different. And I think Helen touched on that, sort of in thinking about how do we design interventions and how do we design studies to evaluate those interventions. So just for example, this is some data from colleagues of mine who from a longitudinal study in Malawi, and just to think about all of these rapid transitions that are happening. We see here that, so this is looking at 3 key transitions or life events: leaving school, sexual debut, and marriage. And we see that for girls, much more so than boys, this rapid succession of transitions. So here we see 40% of girls have, between the ages of 16 to 19, already experienced all 3 of these transitions, compared to only 5% of boys. So this is a lot of really life-shaping events happening in a very short number of years. Another example of something that happens very dramatically for adolescents. So this is some research from my colleague Kelly Holman in South Africa, but we see similar patterns in other countries. So what you see here is she did some mapping work, a series of sort of participatory mapping work with adolescent girls, boys, younger and older. So you see these segments, younger 11 to 12 years old, older 14 to 16 years old, and they map their community of where they could go. And you see that sort of for girls and boys ages 11 to 12, the box, then this was laid on, using GPS. So for the girls and boys, those boxes were more or less the same size when they were 11 to 12. And what we see as girls hit puberty is this rapid shrinking of their worlds, the ability to maybe go to school, but mostly the domestic sphere, and that world narrows for them. Whereas at that same transition age for boys, their world expands. So this is sort of to set the context for all of the things that are happening in adolescence in rapid succession as we think about sort of these types of interventions and the outcomes, the indicators that may be shaping and guiding those transitions, as well as the outcomes on the other end of them. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Adolescent Girls Initiative Kenya. This is a trial that started back in 2014 in 2 sites in Kenya. So one urban informal settlement called Kibera, and another in Wajir County, which is up on the border of Somalia. So very remote, very socially conservative. And we really set out to answer 2 questions. So one was, again, what's the right package of multi-sectoral, multi-level interventions? And so by multi-sectoral, thinking about how do we address these issues of education and economic strengthening and violence prevention, etc., together, and what's the sort of most bang for your buck, so to speak, when it comes to packaging them together, but also multi-level. So acknowledging that it's probably these individual level interventions just targeting girls is likely not enough. And we have to think, what are the barriers at the household level? And what are the barriers at the community level that we need to design for in our interventions? Then the second question is really about thinking about life stage, and Helen touched on this as well. But this particular trial, the theory was really, if we intervene early, so between 11 and 14 years old, that like right before that rapid succession of transitions starts, can we improve longer term outcomes? So 4 intervention components, I'm going to go a little bit quickly because we don't have much time, but all of this, I'll share the links in the chat, so if you want to go more into detail. But the first intervention component was a community level intervention that was really addressed at dealing with violence, and by violence, not just physical or sexual violence, but sort of community norms that undervalue girls. And these were community conversations that took place over the course of 2 years. The second intervention was a household level intervention that really was meant to address both the value of girls' education at the household level, as well as the economic barriers or the financial constraints for households sending girls to school. And this was a conditional cash transfer where money was paid to the household twice per term, so every other month over the 2-year period, so long as the girl was enrolled in school. And then we had 2 individual level interventions. So these were using safe spaces or girls empowerment groups. And one component was really focused on health. So this was a health and life skills curriculum. The groups were segmented by age. Even within that small bracket, we had 11 and 12-year-olds and 13, 14-year-olds in separate groups. In the urban site and in the rural site where there were a lot of out-of-school girls, we segmented them by schooling status. These groups were facilitated by a female mentor and really covered that wide range of health and life skills topics. And then the fourth component was about economic strengthening or wealth creation, and this was layered onto the safe spaces groups. So those groups had an additional curriculum on financial education, learning how to save, set financial goals, budget, as well as some savings activities. So in the rural site, they were given home banks or piggy banks. In the urban site, they were actually supported to open savings accounts, adolescent-friendly savings accounts. And then they were given a small annual incentive of about $3 per year to get their savings going. But as I mentioned, this was really about packages. So here we see the 4 arms. Our control was the community level component. We felt that we could not address community norms about girls. So that was sort of the base. And then we layered on, as you see here. So arm 2 had only the cash transfer layered on, then the safe spaces only with the health and life skills, and then the 4th arm had all 4 components. Our theory of change was that the combination of these interventions would lead to, in the initial stage, so in the initial 2 years, remember these girls were early, and we knew that we wouldn't see delays in childbearing at the very end of the intervention, where the girls were 13 to 16 at that point. But that we would see some asset accumulation, as well as education effects. And then only later, in 2 years after the intervention, did we think we would be able to start to come back and see, did we delay childbearing? Now, as an example of understanding the context, we knew that in the urban site, most sexual activity amongst adolescents happens outside the context of marriage, and therefore delaying childbearing was really about some combination of delaying sexual debut and or increasing use of family planning methods, including condoms. However, in Wajir, that is a setting in which early childbearing happens almost exclusively in the context of marriage. So it really was about first working around delaying marriage, which would then lead to our outcome or our impact measure of delaying childbearing. So this was a randomized control trial. Yes?
5 minutes, thanks.
Perfect. So we had a random cluster assignment, individual cluster assignment. These were 2 separate cohorts. We did not merge the data in analysis, but we ran the 2-year intervention, and then we did, our midline was actually at the end of the 2-year intervention, and then we came back 2 years later. So what did we find? In Wajir, this was 2 years after the end of the program. What we saw was, in particular for the out-of-school girls at baseline, they were 3 times more likely to still be enrolled in school, 20 percentage points less likely to be married, and almost half as likely to ever be pregnant. And so here, this really has very little to do with contraceptive use. I think, you know, CPR in Wajir County, even for married women, is in the single digits. But it really was about, the pathway was about getting girls into school, delaying marriage, which then in turn delayed pregnancy. And we recently, this is unpublished data, but we came back about in September of last year. So this is now 4 years after the program. And we saw the same trends. So still the intervention group much more likely 4 years after the program to be enrolled in school, 20 percentage points less likely to be married, and about 15, 16 percentage points less likely to have been pregnant, which are very similar effect sizes. So in Kibera, which was our urban site, the pathways were going to be a little bit different. So we did see increases in schooling, not at quite as dramatic of an effect size, but still statistically significant. But what we saw here was that there was a decrease in sexual debut. So about 1/3 of the girls in the control had ever had sex, compared to about 1/4 of girls in the intervention arms, which then translated into about half, you know, almost being half less likely to have given birth. What we did not see is contraceptive prevalence. So there was not a difference in uptake of contraceptives, but it really, the pathway here to delaying childbearing did come through delaying sexual debut. And we also had HSV2 biomarker data, which is often an indicator of sexual activity. And we also saw reduced incidence of HSV2. So that really does confirm, I think, for us that the pathway is about delaying sexual debut, reducing sexual behavior, as opposed to contraceptive prevalence. So just very quickly, we had a similar trial that started a couple years earlier in Zambia called the Adolescent Girls Empowerment Program. And it was a similar study design, but all of the interventions were individually focused. And there we did not see any impact on education, pregnancy, or contraceptive use. So I think that leads to really some of our key takeaways is that working across multiple sectors and at multiple levels of a girl's ecosystem is important. I think it's critical to address poverty. That's one of the key structural factors, those underlying economic constraints at the household level, open up change for girl level outcomes, and also thinking about girls' empowerment, life skills, SRH content, economic content. And just finally, a few thoughts about sort of having been engrossed in very specific studies and then zooming out and reflecting on Helen's paper and work. A lot of it really resonates. I think one of the takeaways that just the individual level interventions will not address structural problems is key. Another one is really thinking about the diversity of experience and life stage. So AGIK is an example where we really focused in on early adolescence. And even there, we saw distinctly different outcomes for girls who were in school and out of school at the start of the trial. So really taking the time to understand that diversity, understand the drivers in a particular context. And that sort of leads me to my last maybe thought that I want to leave the group with is that maybe as a field, we need to move away from sort of adolescent contraceptive use as the end game and really framing contraceptive use about as a step, as one possible pathway for certain types of adolescent girls in certain contexts, in certain life stages that will help achieve a broader set of outcomes. And I think that sometimes sort of a narrow focus on ASRH and an even narrower focus in that on contraceptive use amongst adolescents has limited the field from really taking this wider view of the structural barriers, of the need to think multi-sectorally, of the need to think about maybe it's by addressing poverty that we will get the desired health outcomes. And maybe contraceptive use isn't actually the goal for certain adolescents, but it's something else that has just as dramatic and powerful an effect on their life course. So I'll leave this to sort of mull that over. Thank you again for the opportunity and looking forward to Chandra's presentation and the Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant, Karen. Thank you very, very much. Great examples. I love the detail. Thank you. And the reflections to bring us out. Thank you very much for that. We'll have time for questioning in the Q&A just after our last speaker. I'm really happy to invite Chandramouli now to present. Many of you will know Chandramouli from his leading role in adolescent sexual reproductive health over the last 30 years, most prominently at WHO. I don't think I need to say much more than sharing the breaking news that Chandra has been awarded the 2022 Lifetime Achievement Award in Adolescent Health and Medicine by the Society for Adolescent Medicine and Health. So many congratulations, Chandra, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sylvie, and great to follow up after Helen and Karen. So I'm going to speak to enabling adolescents to obtain and use the contraception they want and they need. And I have organized my presentation in 3 parts: a quick look at progress, thinking underpinning policy and program guidance, and 3 country examples. So globally, levels of child marriage have declined, whereas 1 in 3 girls were married 25 years ago. It's now 1 in 4 girls. Although, as you can see from this slide, the progress is uneven between world regions and needs to be accelerated if we are to reach the Sustainable Development Goals targets. Moving to contraception. Globally, the proportion of adolescent girls 15 to 19 whose needs for family planning were satisfied by modern methods has risen between 1995 and 2020. But again, what you see here is, although progress has occurred in all regions, this is very uneven. The Guttmacher Institute study says much the same thing. There are unmet needs for girls and young women who want to use contraception. 40% of them have unmet needs. The third issue in this area is adolescent childbearing. Again, over the last 25 years, adolescent child birth rate has declined in 15 to 19-year-olds, but this decline has been uneven across regions. And a just published report by UNFPA talks about alarmingly slow progress, and that some parts of the world have kind of remained frozen in time. Not a very good analogy with the current heat wave, but have really not changed over the last half a century. So that then is the context we're talking about. Progress has occurred, but the progress is uneven, and some communities, some groups have been left behind. By the early 2010s, there was clear recognition that simply providing adolescent girls contraceptive information and services was not enough. Fully echo the point Karen made. This is not about giving girls and men contraception and assuring, and then leaving it to them to use it and then saying that, they were at fault if they didn't. There was growing recognition that we needed to address the social determinants that contribute to poor adolescent health and well-being, including poor sexual and reproductive health and well-being. And this built on, at least in some cases, a huge body of work on enabling and structural approaches to HIV prevention. But sadly, our fields, even within ASRHR, are siloed. This groundbreaking paper by Osama Tawil, whom I worked with, talked about enabling approaches, and really a paper still worth reading. Helen mentioned this framework. ICRW developed this framework in 2014 and provided a good operational means to taking this discussion forward, addressing the social determinants, and alongside that, addressing access to contraceptive services. In 2017, just before the London Summit on Family Planning, I worked with colleagues in Population Council Kenya, Karen's colleagues, to take this framework and to develop illustrative examples of approaches that could be used, as well as illustrative examples of countries. Very much like what Helen has done now, but less rigorous methodology. And so, as you can imagine, I'm thrilled that Helen has done this work to take this field forward. This thinking of the need to address adolescent social determinants and the need to recognize that adolescents are a heterogeneous group with very different and changing needs, something that both Helen and Karen have talked about, has fed into strategic planning guides, such as the one developed by USAID, and more importantly, more recently, in FP 2030's call for bold and transformative commitments to adolescents and youth. As you can see in the second row, root causes of adolescent pregnancy and childbearing need to be addressed. So I, again, completely endorse what Karen said. The focus on contraception and the focus by many donors on demanding targets to be achieved by initiatives does not take into account that, when girls and young women feel empowered, they may actually decide this is the best time to have a child. And so you cannot measure everything by contraceptive uptake. My third and last segment talks about large-scale and sustained programs. Both Helen and Karen talked about projects, and some of these projects are long-standing, some of them are large, but increasingly in the field, countries ask us for large-scale government-led sustained initiatives. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first is from Scotland. Scotland developed its teenage pregnancy strategy after England did, and drew out lessons from England that progress was made in England, but was very, very unequal. And there were many districts which were doing much worse off than others, and some districts where the situation had actually worsened during the 10-year strategy. Of course, things have improved and have been corrected, but Scotland decided to have an equity-focused strategy because of the data that you see on this slide. Huge levels of inequities. And so what they did was they developed a 4-strand strategy with leadership and accountability, giving young people more control over their lives, pregnancy in young people, and parenthood in young people. Again, placing this in the context of marginalization and increasing opportunities for education and for employment. And what you see in this slide, and again, this is a paper that we are writing up now, is a huge decline in pregnancies, with a much greater decline in areas with the highest levels of deprivation. We're beginning to see this in England as well. We co-authored a paper with Alison Hadley on England. We're writing a follow-up paper on how England then addressed inequities, very much in the principles of what Helen laid out. But okay, you might say that, this is fine. This is okay for a, wealthy country like England to do. What about other countries? And here is a wonderful example. I mean, both the previous speakers, both Helen and Karen, talked about the importance of education. Look at what they did in Jamaica, a program which is 40 years old now, which has been exported to many Caribbean countries, is in the process of being exported to some African countries, second chances for adolescent mothers. The problem that this initiative addressed was no continuous education opportunities for pregnant adolescents, limited or no re-entry opportunities for adolescent mothers, and high rates of rapid repeat pregnancies. So they put in place an intervention package, which was primarily focused on keeping girls in a school setting and getting them back into school. Then they also started including family planning, counseling and services, and childcare and parenting skills, and including what they say baby fathers, fathers of these babies, with a huge challenge because of the laws on statutory rape. And what you see in Jamaica is very much like what Karen said. Their focus was on giving these girls a second chance with education. For those who wanted, they provided family planning counseling, and they provided other services. But what they saw was a huge, many of these girls grabbed the opportunity to get back to school, take charge of their lives. Here's one of the testimonials from the paper, and a whole bunch of studies. And I've cited one study here in the paper. You'll see a number of studies which talk about the power of such approaches with intensive education. And Helen talked about going beyond telling girls not to get pregnant again, but engaging with families and communities in an ongoing dialogue and working to give girls opportunities with their lives. The last example is something that I'm really inspired by. Ethiopia is today in a terrible situation with the war in Tigray, and many terrible things happening there. But in the 15 years of the Millennium Development Goals period, they did some magic things, and they made strategic choices with sound leadership. They wanted to achieve all their Millennium Development Goals. And in the context of the MDGs, they decided to address childhood mortality reduction and maternal mortality reduction. They decided to focus on the rural areas where 80% of the population resides. And they also had complementary activities in improving education for girls and water and sanitation, a whole package of actions. They employed 35,000 health extension workers to deliver primary services in the community, to link them up to health facilities which had been refurbished and then staffed with competent people and with referral linkages. And these health extension workers were from the community. They had a huge mandate to do community engagement activities, working with people to challenge and change norms on contraceptive use, on maternal health use, on school use, and the results speak for themselves. In Ethiopia, you have a decline in just published paper, a decline in child marriage, a decline in female genital mutilation, a huge increase in contraceptive uptake, particularly in postpartum contraceptive uptake, and declines in HIV. You know, what you have is when you put the systems in place, it takes time. It takes 10 years. It takes 15 years for these results to be achieved. But what you see in Ethiopia is you don't need to, and in Jamaica, you don't need to wait till the country becomes wealthy in order to improve health outcomes for adolescents, including sexual and reproductive health outcomes. So that brings me to my the concluding messages. You know, globally, there's been a huge improvement in adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights. I challenge the framework of the Lancet Commission, which always paints a glass half empty picture. Globally, girls are much less likely to be married, much less likely to have female genital mutilation, much less likely to be mothers, much more likely to use contraception and maternal health services. Progress has been slow and uneven. And within every country and community, including high-income countries, multiple intersecting vulnerabilities means that groups of adolescents are left behind, sometimes small groups, sometimes large groups. There's growing recognition of the importance of enabling adolescents to make and act on their reproductive choices by addressing what Osama Tawil described as legal policy and procedural constraints and restraints, social and cultural norms, and economic constraints. So enable adolescents to take charge of their lives and to make decisions which may not necessarily mean increased contraceptive uptake. Finally, there's a growing body of research evidence, programmatic experience, and normative guidance, which places adolescent sexual and reproductive health within the broader context of their lives. Happily, a small but growing number of countries are putting these activities in place and demonstrating the feasibility of applying these approaches at scale in a sustained manner and to demonstrate the value of doing this. Alison Hadley, one of my great heroes who led England's teenage pregnancy strategy, said, you know, we often talk about norm change when we're talking about northern Uganda or northern India or rural Pakistan. But there were communities in England where the grandmother, mother, and daughter all were teenage mothers. And they thought that they would also be teenage mothers. And officials said, there's nothing you can do with these people. That's what they're going to do with their lives. So there was a norm change in officials, norm change in communities. And what England has shown and Jamaica has shown and Ethiopia has shown is we can put these approaches in place. So to conclude, you know, I welcome the review by Helen. I think this is important. This shines light on an important area of work that we need much more attention to, and hopefully it'll educate many donors who still want to put on the money on the table and see this in 3 years reflected in increased contraceptive uptake. Thank you, and back to you, Solveig.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chandra. That's really inspiring. And so I'd like to open up the Q&A and encourage people to send in any questions for this panel to address. I'll kick it off. I have one most immediately for Chandra. I loved your examples of how this can be done at the national leadership, and the focus today is on how these interventions can happen. I'm also interested, if I can ask, in why it happened. What convinced Jamaica, Ethiopia, Scotland to be bold in a controversial area like adolescent sex and pregnancy?
So I will give you, I encourage you to read this paper. It's a paper that we supported, written by a whole group of people from Jamaica. But it was in many places, and we're publishing now a set of 6 countries which have scaled up comprehensive sexuality education nationwide. For me, the most important least common denominator, I hate that term, but the common thread you see everywhere is that there's someone getting up every morning who wants to work in this area and drive this agenda. Jeremy Shiftman, who's a political scientist who's examined why maternal mortality was a priority before the MDG agenda, talks about policy coalitions, about groups of people who come together and who can influence the agenda, who cannot be bribed, who cannot be silenced, and who do not know everything, but know how to find their way moving forward. That's just what happened in Jamaica. And I think to some extent, that's just what happened in England. England still has the worst teenage pregnancy rate in Western Europe, but a group of people came together and used the opportunity that Tony Blair opened up when he talked about social exclusion and placed this together and made that happen. Yeah. In Ethiopia, it was Tedros, who's our Director General, who said, this needs to be done. So, you often have visionary leadership combined with good science.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks very much, Chandra. So Sally Griffin has hand raised, and I wonder if Sally is able to use the mic. Does that work? Oh, here we go. Sally, give it a go. You've been granted the microphone. Sorry, you're on mute, Sally. Do give it a go, please. Okay, I see that.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Sally.
Hi. Yes, I'm really sorry. That was my phone was blocking it. I actually raised my hand by mistake, but okay. Yeah, it's been very, very interesting, and I'm really happy to see this discussion about widening away from focusing on contraception, about how donor policies are sometimes pushing us in that way, and this has been really useful to step back from that. And yes, as Chandra said, I hope that it will also have an impact on a greater level. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sally. Okay, are there any questions that others have? You can post. Okay, we have one from Shruti Shukla for Helen. During your systematic review, did you identify some key mechanisms of change behind why interventions worked in increasing contraceptive use? What were these? I'll let you respond to that first, Helen. There's a second.
Hi, thanks for that question. No, we didn't. And the reason was because we felt we couldn't, if we had confidence in our categorization of the most effective and the least effective, we could have looked to unpick, well, what characteristics were associated with the most effective and the most likely ineffective and harmful. But because we couldn't, which was for a number of methodological reasons, and including issues that Karen and Chandra raised, such as the intervention might have been really effective at delaying first sex or delaying marriage, so that there was a smaller sample that they were asking, are you using contraception? So the interventions might have been effective in a bigger picture, but in terms of contraceptive use, they weren't effective. But to then badge them as being an ineffective study didn't make sense to us. So we weren't actually able to look at the characteristics and say with certainty what led to this or that intervention being effective or ineffective. We had hoped to do that, but it just wasn't possible. Was there a second part to that question?
Yeah, there's a second part. So if there were mechanisms, the question was, were these mechanisms different for interventions in different parts of the world? For example, Prachar in India and AGIK in Kenya.
Yeah, so I think they will definitely be different. Like I said, we didn't look at it. Both those studies were included in our review though. And there are a number of factors. It's the population that you're focused on, but also which of those objectives was the intervention trying to address. They weren't all trying to address all of the objectives. And there were, as you can see, there were different routes to try and achieve those objectives, meet those objectives as well. So I definitely think there were a number of different routes that you could go through.
So we kind of need a range of complementary outcomes, right, Helen? We're not just focused on one or the other, but either or can make for a successful program, right, depending on the needs. Aoife has a comment and question. Thanks for great presentations. Can the panel members comment on the cost of the most successful interventions? How can we address multiple layers and stakeholders while keeping the costs low and affordable? Should we move towards interventions that address broader adolescent health and well-being, like pooling resources to try to influence multiple outcomes? SRH, mental health and violence.
I can take a stab, specifically in the Kenyan context, at least for AGIK. So we did do a cost effectiveness component in the trial, and we did find that there were efficiencies in layering the program together in terms of the cost of delivery, also combined with the number of different outcomes that we saw change on. However, I think two things have happened. So one is one of the other sort of findings of that analysis was that really cost effectiveness would be achieved at scale. So the fact that we were only reaching, a small number of girls in the context of a trial was limiting. But just to say, what we're actually doing now is another round of the trial with a new cohort, and this time the government, the county government, is implementing the intervention. And we're testing a couple of different sort of scaled down versions specifically for that point of getting the cost a bit lower, in particular around the cash transfer, seeing how we can reshape that a little bit. So I think that cost is very important, in particular when thinking about, is this something that a government will take up and own and move forward at scale?
Thanks, Karen.
Just to add as well, though, that some of the study authors did make the point of saying the amount of effort required and the time required to establish the interventions and get the community on board at the start, and that sort of thing, where there might be resistance. So those sorts of things, and doing that in community engagement work, where you're not just doing a mass media campaign, but you're really engaging with the community, it is clearly much more resource intensive than, shoving up some billboards or something.
So I agree to what Karen and Helen have said, but I'd like to start talking about effectiveness. Before we talk about cost effectiveness, we've spent millions of dollars on ineffective programs. And let me give you one example. Training health workers. 80% of the budgets of many initiatives is for one-off training of health workers. And we know it doesn't work. We know that there are no long-standing benefits of one-off training of health workers. It's still done because it serves a useful function in work plans to tick off and say health workers trained. We need to start talking about effective approaches. We talk about takes a village to raise a child. It's very much a village to improve lives of adolescents. We need costing. There are cost effectiveness studies for every intervention that's part of the universal health package. And as Karen has said, once these systems are in place and they work, costs come down. Putting them in place is going to be expensive because in many places they don't exist. School health services don't exist. School-based sexuality education is on paper in many places. So, our cost effectiveness, cost benefits, they are difficult discussions at this stage. I think what we need now is good effectiveness studies and good costing studies.
Thanks. So related to that, Rebecca has raised a question. How can we better communicate to donors the need for rigorous evaluations? Who would like to take that?
We need to, donors, who are donors? Donors are people like you and me, and they want to come and do something good. They are often, if they are early in their careers, want to make safe investments. They want to succeed. They don't want to fail. They want to make safe investments. So the way I've worked with donors, such as with Packard Foundation, whom I have a 15-year relationship with, I'll go into an initiative and tell them that this could fail. Would you be prepared for a failure? So you need to be able to work with donors, just like with media people, like with everyone else, with building long-term relationships. Karen didn't talk about her study in Kenya and how long it took. You need a trusting relationship where you don't know everything, nor does the donor, and they need to be willing to engage and listen, be prepared for failures and be prepared for changes in course. And I think that only comes when they themselves are secure in themselves. And I think we can do that by coming together as a community like today and, saying and educating them and working with them.
Thanks. We are down to our last minute or so. Alize has a question for Karen. What contextual factors in Wajir and Nairobi do you think were important in influencing the impact of AGIK in both contexts? Thank you.
Thank you. So I do think because the pathways were different in the two sites. And so I think understanding that context about Wajir was a setting where 25% of the girls in our sample just not only were out of school at the age of 11 to 14, but had never been to school. So this was a group that was really like on the cusp of being about to be married and sort of put on that pathway. And so I think that the combination of interventions sort of created an environment in which moving them into the education sector, moving them into schooling really had a very profound impact, long-term impact on their lives. And what we've seen is that sort of once they're into school, they have been mostly staying in school even 4 years after the intervention ended. I would say another thing and why we're really focused on, I'm not sure if this is the kind of context you were asking about, but that the county government in Wajir has been partner number one. They have been unbelievably supportive, engaged, involved in the curriculum and the intervention design, both in the first trial and in the one that we're doing now with them as the implementers. So I think that has been a key contextual factor in the success, because it really is such a socially conservative place. There's not a lot of interventions for girls going on there. And let me start. And I think in Nairobi, it's just, what can I say about the context in Nairobi? I think there it really was about this combination of supporting education, but also the economic empowerment. We saw long-term impacts on savings behavior that allowed girls to sort of change the dynamics of their sexual relationships, their sexual partners, which then had follow-on effects. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. I'm just checking here. So we've reached the end of the time. Can I just quickly check in if our speakers would like to add any final parting comments? Okay, so in that case, let me please thank them very much and all of you for joining again on what has been a very hot and distracting day. If I could just close by saying that the point was to learn which ideas, which interventions, which strategies have evidence. And we've learned a little bit about that today. We've learned a lot about that today. There's a lot of encouraging signs in different contexts, but so those are the ideas and the evidence that we're looking for. But if anything coming out of this is it's not just the ideas and evidence, the people, it's the champions, it's the communities, it's the governments committed to leading and implementing those. And that includes us. Chandra's reminded us, we are in that village, we are all in it. So these structural drivers are intractable at times, it feels, and in many ways they're getting harder, not easier to address with current climates, like the actual literal climate, as well as the political climate, ideological climates, war, poverty, pandemics are not making this any easier. But we've got a lot of encouraging examples today. We've got a lot of evidence that's emerging, and with research that Helen and team are doing, they'll be more consistent, more easy to synthesize and learn from, hopefully in a few years down the road. So thank you everybody for the thoughts, the commitment, and power on.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. Signing off.
Thank you.
Sedal does like to learn and improve the webinars all the time. If anyone can fill out the evaluation, that's incredibly helpful. Thanks all.
It should pop up in your browser webinar. Thank you.